right?
That's right.
You're the president of the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union.
Right.
That's a pretty important job, isn't it?
Well, you know, to us it is.
I mean, to you it is, I guess. So why don't you tell us, like, what is the ACLU, first of all? Like, to people who've never heard this before.
Okay, to people who have never heard of the ACLU, you've already said the main thing, which is what the letters stand for, American Civil Liberties Union. And we like to think of ourselves as the lawyers for the Bill of Rights. We're about American civil liberties, which means we don't really do international work. We only take care of the rights of Americans. And the ACLU started in 1920. So a little bit of history, I think, is always important to who we are.
Absolutely.
And we started in 1920, right after World War I. And it was in response to two different kinds of civil liberties problems that were going on at the time. One of which was that during the war, during World War I, when people spoke out against the war or against the draft or said anything else that the government didn't like them saying, people were being prosecuted for speech. And at the time, it's surprising to us today that you could be prosecuted for saying things that were anti-government. But really, the courts had not yet established the idea that the First Amendment protects you from saying things like that. So part of the fact that we now think that that's unusual, I think is a tribute to a lot of the work the ACLU has done. So the second thing that was happening right after World War I, which is another kind of theme of the kind of work that we do, one of the concerns of the day, one of the scares was about anarchists, and not just communists, but anarchists. And in fact, there were people in the country who were agitating, and there was this Attorney General at the time, Mitchell Palmer, and a bomb went off pretty near his house. So he overreacted, I think it's fair to say. And so they didn't really know who had set off the bomb. So what he did was he had thousands of people arrested, and anybody who was not an American citizen was deported, especially if they came from Eastern European countries, which was considered to be the kind of hotbed of anarchism. These were people, there was no evidence that they believed in anything, even anarchism, no evidence that they had done anything wrong. Some of the people reported having been seriously abused while they were being detained, harshly interrogated, even up to torture. And there was this whole sense of the American people at the time that that was probably all right because it was keeping us safe. So one of the first things that the ACLU did in 1920 was to issue a report about the Palmer raids and explain to the American people what had happened to all these innocent people. So just to give those two examples, I think we could talk maybe more about how those themes continue through our work. But the fact that at the time there was nobody really standing up for the First Amendment and standing up for due process, that shouldn't happen to people. We shouldn't be doing things like that just to think that maybe we're better safe than sorry.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's something that comes up a lot these days, isn't it? It's like, I mean, well, it's always a thing. Like every country, no matter where you are in the world, people want to be heard because they have things that they need to say. It's pretty much the gist of this. So, like in modern day, what do you think is the most pressing civil rights issue? Like, is it freedom of speech, or is it some other aspect?
Well, the ACLU actually has about 16 different areas where we work. We do free speech, but we also do today's counterpart to the Palmer raid problem is national security. Mm-hmm. We do work for reproductive freedom and for equality, racial equality, gender equality, LGBT equality. We do immigration. So we have 16 different areas that we work in. So in a way, you're asking me to choose which is the most important. It's like asking a mother, which of your children do you love the best?
Exactly. Well, I mean, suppose the 15 of them had to go for some reason, and you got to save one on the lifeboat.
Okay, well, right now, given that we're speaking in October, late October 2012, I think right now the one that needs to be in the lifeboat is voting rights.
Right.
So one of the things that we're very active in doing, the ACLU is nonpartisan. So we neither support nor oppose any candidate. But what we are for is that everybody should be able to vote. Right? So I'm sure that you're aware, and probably most of the audience is aware, that there are, in connection with the presidential election, there have been a number of concerns raised about the fact that a number of states have been changing their rules about who gets to vote, what you have to do to vote, what the rules about voting are, the registration rules. And our concern about this is that the people who are being left out, the people for whom it's being made hard for them to vote, tend to be minorities, the poor, the elderly, the disabled, people who, it's just concerning. So there are a lot of groups One reason why this is happening is that in a lot of states that have Republican legislatures, there is a correlation between those particular groups and people who tend to vote for Democrats. So the suspicion is that the Republican legislatures are passing these laws because they want to stay in power, right? And they don't want people, the Democratic voters to be voting too often. But what they say out loud is that this is to prevent voter fraud.
Right.
Now, in most of these states, there haven't been examples of voter fraud. It's sort of like a solution in search of a problem.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number, I think, you hear a lot about this problem from a lot of groups that are concerned about promoting more votes for the Democrats. But here's what the ACLU is all about. I promise you, we would be doing the same things if the people who were being disenfranchised were Republicans. We're about the system. We're not about whether or not the Democrats win. And to me, there are a lot of things wrong with the system. So, we can talk more about examples of that if you like, or I don't know if you want to talk about other areas or delve more into that.
I mean, like, sure, why not?
Okay.
I mean, I don't know, sure. Whatever you feel is important to be said about this.
Okay, well, let me just give a few examples then about the kind of thing we do, and since we're in this area.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, in 2012, in this election, there were a lot of people who were sort of, realizing that these laws are a problem. That there are over 30 states in the last year that have passed laws requiring special voter identifications before you can register to vote, or that have limited early registration, or have done away with same-day registration. They've made it hard for third parties to help people register. So in 2008, the ACLU brought the first lawsuit about this in Indiana. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court, much to our disappointment, upheld the Indiana voter registration law. And that's why we now have 31 pieces of litigation in 22 different states about all these voter restriction statutes because the Supreme Court wouldn't do it in one fell swoop. So another thing about the ACLU that I think is important is that we have affiliates in every state. So we are, kind of uniquely situated, whether the issue is voting rights or reproductive freedom or immigration or all those other areas. We are on the ground in all these different states. So to give you an example, when the Nebraska legislature was considering some of these voter restriction rules, we did some lobbying, and Nebraska actually ended up not adopting the concerning rules. We're bringing lawsuits, we're doing public education. So that's just one example of how we work around the country and in this one area.
Excellent, excellent. So I guess we're talking a lot about things that people might be able to learn from reading the newspaper. But what about you personally, Susan Herman? How did you get to be in the position and the job that you're in right now?
Okay, let me give you, there are always several answers to that. Aristotle says there are any number of kinds of causes. So one thing, when I was first elected as president of the ACLU, people started asking, well, how did you become interested in civil liberties?
That was my other question.
Oh, there you go. Well, let me start with that, and then we can maybe switch to the other in terms of more recent. My feeling is that a lot of our values are really set when we're pretty young. And so I was thinking back to what is the earliest point at which I can remember having the kinds of thoughts and values that sort of drive the ACLU and drive me. And the earliest point that I could remember was I was in 3rd grade, and I went to public school in Long Beach, New York, on Long Island. Mm-hmm. And we were at the time in 3rd grade, my class was doing a play of Johnny Tremaine. I don't know if you've ever, it was about a boy in the Revolutionary War.
Right.
Yeah. Some people have read it, some haven't. So in a play, there aren't all that many words. And so I was interested in the story. So I went to the school library and I decided I would take out the book so that I could read more about the story. And I think you're going to be surprised by this. The librarian told me I was not allowed to take out the book. And the reason was that it was in the boys section.
Oh, no.
Oh yes.
Oh.
So, I actually knew that there was a girls section because I had been reading the fairy tale books and the biographies of presidents' wives and Clara Barton and the things that they thought girls should read.
Now, when was this?
This is the mid-50s.
Right, okay.
In public school, right, okay?
Sure.
So I'm just that old.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take it that way.
That's all right. That's all right. But so to me, this wasn't that surprising because it was the way the world was at the time. We were living by stereotypes and, girls became nurses and boys became doctors and etc. So I went home and I told my mother that I wasn't allowed to take this book out of the library. And, steam kind of out of her ears. So she wrote me a note to give the librarian to say I should be allowed to read Johnny Tremain and any other book I wanted, and what was wrong with their library anyway. So I read Johnny Tremain, but what was interesting to me was that my mother stood up to this, and that there were these people who thought they knew better than I did what I should be reading, and I disagreed. I wanted to read things that they didn't think I should be reading. And my mother stood up to that and said, wait a minute, we get to make this decision. You don't get to make it for us. And to me, that's a kind of thread that runs through a lot of civil liberties work. Who's going to tell you what kind of family you have, or who you can marry, or whether you have to have children, or who can vote? Don't we get, or what religion you should have? I think we should get to decide those things for ourselves. So that I think is my early influence. My mother was the first civil libertarian I knew.
What better influence, right?
What better?
Excellent. All right, so that was your early childhood?
That was my early childhood.
And then, what did you do, so you just always decided that you were going to fight for civil liberties, but was there, another track that you got caught on before you came back to?
There actually was, and I don't think I really had always decided that that was something I was going to do. Mm-hmm. I think the whole sense of what's right to you is something that's established early. But I think people have many different paths that they take through life. And so what I did first was, after I graduated from college, I was working for a magazine that was about classical music and the performing arts.
Oh.
So I did that for a while, and then I went to law school because I thought I needed to change the world through law.
Of course.
And that was when I really discovered the ACLU. So I'll tell you that story, since I think that's more directly related. I had a law professor who was working with the New York Civil Liberties Union, and I was his research assistant for the summer, and we were supposed to be doing some academic research. But what happened was that some students came into the New York Civil Liberties Union who were having a problem. And these were 6 graduate students at Stony Brook in New York, out on Long Island. And they were sharing a house, these 6 graduate students. And when they went to get their residence-only beach permit, because there was this little beach in this town, they were told that they were illegal residents and they couldn't have a beach permit. And the reason that they were illegal was that the town, this was 1 square mile little place, was totally zoned for one-family homes. And family was defined in the law as no more than 2 people unrelated by blood, marriage, or adoption. So these 6 students were not allowed to share a house because they weren't related. Now, my feeling about this is outrageous. Who's the government to tell you who can live within your house? If they want to say, okay, maybe we think that groupers are going to be noisy, let them have a law saying don't be noisy. Or, don't, mess up parking or whatever. But to say you can't live together was a little crazy. So we ended up writing a complaint because the students were really being threatened with criminal prosecution. And under New York law, violating the zoning ordinance was considered to be disorderly conduct. And every day on which they violated the zoning ordinance was considered to be a separate violation. So by the time they found out about this, they were liable for millions of dollars in fines and hundreds of years in prison. So nuts, right? So we're working very hard, and we write this complaint, and we go before a federal judge. And the federal judge looks at the order that we've asked him to sign, and the order was, please, just let the kids live there and leave them alone until we figure out whether this is constitutional. So he looks at this and talks to the village attorney, and he says, well, I'm inclined to sign this, but do you mind if I add something? And we said, And he said, well, it's the summer. Don't you think your clients would like to be able to go to the beach while this case is pending? Can I write that in? And we said, well, that would be all right. So he writes in hand in the order, and they have to be allowed to go to the beach. Mm-hmm. Okay, so flash forward. I'm then sent out to Belterre to talk to our clients as the junior member of the team. So they're showing me all around the house and the neighborhood, and I'm telling them what happened in court. And then they take me to the beach to show me the scene of whatever. So the minute that their tires hit the parking lot, this very large man comes across the parking lot and says, what are you doing here? And so they all look at me. And I'm thinking, what am I supposed to do about this large man who doesn't want us in his parking lot? And then I remember, well, I actually have a federal court order in my pocket. Nice. So I pull out my court order and I said, well, I'm with the New York Civil Liberties Union, sort of, and I have a court order saying that these people are allowed to go to this beach. So he looks at me, and he looks at the court order, and he melted. And I thought, this is cool, I want to do this.
wave pieces of paper in people's faces.
Exactly.
And just get around.
Have the court behind you.
Exactly.
It's just like my mom, right, standing up to the library.
Exactly like that. It's perfect.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. You get to do what you've always wanted to do, sort of. I mean,
Sort of, but what it's really all about is just this whole basic perception. To me, most of what the ACLU does is about the golden rule.
yes.
It's like, you want to practice your religion, go ahead, but don't prevent me from practicing my religion, because you wouldn't like if somebody did that to you, and on down the line.
Exactly right. Okay. So the ACLU is fundamentally a neutral party. They are only
Nonpartisan.
nonpartisan.
in terms of
Excuse me.
politics,
Right.
that's
Not neutral.
And neutral
It's
is another way to put it.
you know, neutral. Be like,
That
we don't
neutral
do
is
it.
fair enough.
But okay. So like, you have the ACLU has backed some perhaps unpopular groups like the KKK or such neo-Nazis, for example, and helped them get rights to, or fought. Like there's a case right now going on there in Georgia for the KKK wanted to be part of the Adopt a Highway program, but they're like, no, we don't want you to do that. And so then, so do you think that, is it difficult sometimes when other people are like, why are you supporting these people that we don't like?
Well, let me say the two is, it's easy and it's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
What's difficult about it is that sometimes we very much disagree with what these groups want to say. And I would say a little bit differently. It's not so much that we back the groups, we back their right to speak.
Right.
And it's not that we agree with them. And people say that, oh, you must be communist, oh, you must be, but that's not it. To me, the First Amendment is content neutral. You have the right to say what you want to say, even if it's stupid, even if it's ugly, and that's our tradition. And the basic idea which we live by on the First Amendment area is that the antidote to bad speech is more speech. So when the members of the Nazi Party are saying hateful things, what you need to do is have people talk back. There was a parade of the Ku Klux Klan in New York not that many years ago, where there were people who said, don't let them march, they're really hateful people. So they marched, and we defend their right to march. And so they're 47 bedraggled people. The Klan was not that powerful anymore. And they're having this little parade through New York City, and 8,000 New Yorkers showed up, lining the parade right with their sign saying, wrong, we disagree.
Right.
And to me, that's what should happen. So the principle is pretty clear. And no matter how much we hate the speech, I think, you have to defend it, because tomorrow somebody's going to turn around and say, what you're saying, I find hateful and you can't.
Exactly. It'd be like a gateway. It's like after you start throwing them out, you throw somebody else's rights out.
Exactly. And everybody says, well, I believe, and somebody just today said to me, I believe in free speech, but why should people in North Carolina have an ad on the bus that's anti-Israel? Isn't that wrong?
Right.
If you believe that you want your posters up, they have the right to have their posters too. But so where it's hard is that sometimes you really do hate the speech. So I happened to be at the Supreme Court the day that they handed down the opinion in the Westboro Baptist Church case.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was the case where there's these people who show up at military funerals, and a soldier has died, and there's the family at the funeral. And these people have the theory that the reason that soldiers die is because the United States is not sufficiently homophobic. So this is hateful in many ways. They're being unkind to the families who are grieving. And we so disagree with what they're saying. But when this case came before the Supreme Court, we held our noses and wrote the brief saying, government can't tell them what they can't say. You can have time, place, and manner restrictions. You can say you can't get too close to the families and be right in their faces, but you can't say you can't say that. So the Supreme Court announced their decision, and they announced that they were ruling in favor of the Westboro Baptist Church. And I can tell you, we weren't celebrating. Nobody felt good that the families were, that these people were doing this to these families. But to me, the principle is what you do have to preserve.
Exactly right. And I just found out that the Westboro Church only has less than 50 members now. Yeah. So it's
they never had many members. I think what they're really about is the publicity.
Exactly. But just many people have heard of them. Just the small.
Well, part of it I think is because of the Supreme Court case.
Yeah.
And I think that was what they wanted, was to get that much publicity.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Okay, so recently there was a video that was put out called The Innocence of Muslims, which has been frowned upon by almost everybody. But I understand that the ACLU sided with the US government, calling it hate speech, Or is this true? Or is this?
We certainly would not side with anybody suppressing it.
Well, I just mean, you have the same opinion that it was hateful speech. Is that true? Or is that...
Well, I have the opinion that it's a very nasty film and not at all true. I mean, what they're trying to do is a very hateful film toward Muslims. The Obama administration took the position that, in fact, this film should not be censored, right? And that's where we agree with them. I think had they taken the opposite position of saying they want to shut down the film and nobody's allowed to say that, we would have had a problem with that, because it is speech, it's hateful speech. I'll give you, I had a Dutch reporter come talk to me a few years ago. He was in New York for the anniversary of Henry Hudson sailing up the Hudson River.
Okay.
And while he was here, there was a member of the Dutch parliament, Geert Wilders, who was saying really nasty things about Muslims, kind of a little similar to the film you're talking about. And in Holland, there's this law that says anybody can go into court and prosecute somebody for hate speech. So, some Dutch person went into court and was prosecuting this member of parliament for saying really horrible things about Muslims, untrue, horrible. The reporter said to me, so what do you think about that? And we had the conversation that we were just having about, why you can't say, don't say that, it's better to kind of talk more. You have people who say nasty things like that. If they're not allowed to say them, then they fester. So we were talking about this, and then it happened that I was having my constitutional law class in law school, first-year students, about 100 first-year students. And so I invited him to come talk to my students, because I figured one thing, he's hearing from the president of the ACLU. So he went into my class, and he explained to the 100 first-year law students what was going on, and he said to them, so what do you think? Is it okay to prosecute this person for hate speech? And to a person, the student said, no. And he was shocked, because in Holland, that's not the answer. In Holland, the answer is, this is really hateful, you can't say it. So I think that, to me, this is not just the ACLU thinks this. I think this is a very profound American value. And I think that most people, if they really think about it, about the golden rule aspect of this, don't disagree. But it's very hard when you confront an individual case where you really don't like what somebody's saying, or this film, which in fact is inciting people all over the Arab world. But sometimes you hate the speech, but I think it's the hard cases where you do have to hold the line, because otherwise it's just going to be too easy to repress any unpopular point of view. And we're going to be back to World War I, where the government can say, oh, we're in a war, you can't say I hate the draft. You can't say this war is wrong. I don't think those are our traditional American values.
Right. In wartime, though, do you think it's ever okay for such a thing to be enacted? Because suppose, martial law needs to be declared because everybody's just rioting in the streets. Do you think that there are times when the government can say we need to crack down for this moment to fix things?
I think there are times when it's okay to crack down if you're really talking martial law. If the country is invaded, or the Civil War was a really fraught time because that war really took place within the United States. And there are some measures that would be appropriate, but I think the problem is it's very fact specific. And you were asking before about some of the issues that I most care about. And one of the things that's one of my own personal concerns is what we do in the name of national security after 9/11.
Right.
And I think that a lot of those things are really overreactions.
Yeah, well, brings me to my next point.
Excellent.
I
haven't even read your script.
I know.
But you're just asking good questions.
Thank you. So yeah, so I guess so we have these restrictions that have been put in place after 9/11, but it's been 11 years now, and I've been listening to the debates with Romney and Obama, and 9/11 has hardly come up at all. But these restrictions are still in place as a reaction to terrorism and everything else that comes along with that line of thinking. What do you think we should do about that? Or the government should do?
Well, great question. I think what we should be doing about it is we should be rethinking a whole lot. After 9/11, of course, everybody was very upset, and so we got about 5 or 6 weeks after 9/11, the end of October, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, which is hundreds of amendments to previous law in many different areas. And what I'm actually going to be speaking about at Clark this evening, as part of the dialogue series, is the impact of some of those measures on ordinary Americans. The surveillance laws, all these criminal law dragnets, government secrecy, There are a whole lot of things that were put into the law in the Patriot Act and kind of related actions in the fall of 2001. And as you're saying, Herman, we're now 11 years after that. And to me, it's understandable that right in the immediate crisis and the aftermath, we didn't exactly know what the right things were to do to counter terrorism because we hadn't yet studied what happened on 9/11. And how do you have an antidote when you don't really know what the problem is? So it was 5 years before the 9/11 Commission started to really look at, well, what went wrong? And what could we do about it? So, not surprising that some of the initial guesses were wrong. I'll give you one example. One of the things that was going on a lot during the fall of 2001 was that the government decided to prevent terrorism by stopping the flow of money to the terrorists. And they had this theory that money was being raised in mosques in Brooklyn and traveling to Al-Qaeda. So what they did was they did a major investigation of every Muslim charity in the country, and they shut down most of the major Muslim charities, just shut them down, seized their assets. A lot of people don't know this story. So they really put perfectly legitimate charities out of business. And it turned out in retrospect that that really wasn't a problem. The money was not, it's not like the money was coming from the United States to finance Al-Qaeda. It was coming from Saudi Arabia, first of all, and not very much of it was necessary to send a few people to flight school. So it was just, it was kind of a wrong idea, like the wrong direction, and we're putting all our resources there. So what I would like to see happen is I would like to see Congress get serious about looking at, are we doing the right things? I was reading an article today, it was just in the New York Times, about whether 11 years later, we've now spent $690 billion in the last decade on national security. That's not counting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's not clear what we've gotten for that money. So I'd like to see us ask some questions about what's going on. Now, you were saying that this hasn't come up a lot during the debates. And the reason for that is that there is not a hair between Obama's positions and the Republican positions on this. Obama has taken very different positions as to Guantanamo and torture and the sort of international aspects from what President Bush did. But on the Patriot Act, on all the surveillance provisions, etc., he's taken, his positions are no different. He wants to continue all the surveillance and all the structures that were put in place.
Yeah. All right, well, yeah, so, and I guess another thing, like, in addition to the Patriot Act was quite a while ago, but we've recently had the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act, which there was, I think I have it here actually, which says, it's like subtitle D of section 10 was like, we can now detain American citizens.
Right.
Yeah.
If there's substantial evidence that they might be terrorists, right?
Right, but that's still an infringement on the Constitution.
Yes.
So what is your view on that?
My view on that is that it's an infringement on the Constitution, in short. I think that even President Obama thought that it was an infringement on the Constitution. And in signing the whole package of the National Defense Authorization Act, that's the whole budget for the Defense Department. Right. So he wrote a signing statement saying, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to use this power. So if he were the only president who was ever going to be ever, it might not be a problem. However, it's like all the Patriot Act provisions. Somebody else comes into office and they might not use the provisions in the same kind of way. Right? And so we're very concerned about that. Plus the National Defense Authorization Act had other little hidden goodies in it. Among them are some provisions that would really undermine the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And there are a number of other things that we're quite concerned about. So there are places where, while George W. Bush was president, we just opposed a lot of what he was doing. President Obama has been more complicated for us because in some places he's very much an ally. We've been working together on voting rights, on immigration, on LGBT rights. But there are other places where we really disagree with his policies.
It's very difficult when you're the President of the United States to really just completely change everything. You can't do that. You'd get thrown out. Something would happen. People would just not take your side. So it's a fine line to tread, isn't it? It's
a fine line. Plus, my husband says it's sort of like having one of those giant tankers out at sea. I can't remember what his figure was, but it like takes them 5 miles to turn around.
Right.
The federal government is really big. So. And there are all these people working in the agencies who aren't even the political appointees at the top. So to tell all the lawyers working on cases, okay, we're just going to reverse position and take the opposite position. Or to say to all the people in the Pentagon or the CIA, oh, all right, just change everything and reverse. Yeah, not so easy.
Yeah, in any organization.
Exactly, in any organization.
Take the ACLU. So what if there was going to be some major restructuring? How long would that take? It's like,
Well, we actually just did some major reorganization.
oh, okay.
But two different parts. We did major reorganization of the staff.
Mhm.
We used to have like 16 different projects and divisions, and we just reorganized them into 4 centers. And that didn't take so long. What's taking a longer time, we're looking at the structure of our board because we have these 50 affiliates, and it's complicated. So we've spent a few years doing that.
Right.
So you're absolutely right, change is hard.
But maybe you could give the government a couple tips.
Well, or maybe they could give us some, right?
Perhaps. Everybody, dialogue, talking.
Dialogue.
Speech.
Absolutely.
Very important. Let's see. Do I have anything else? I think. All right. So, are there any misconceptions that you think exist in the minds of society about the ACLU that you'd like to clear up right here and now?
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Of course.
This is sort of, we've learned in the debates that you need the fact checkers afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where the ACLU needs fact checkers because there are several myths. I actually have given talks at some universities called Myths About the ACLU.
Right.
One of the myths, a lot of people think, first of all, they don't understand that we're nonpartisan, so they think we're kind of pro-Democrats or pro-progressives. And we have many members who are libertarians, who are really quite conservative, but who really believe in free speech and in privacy. And so we have different complexes of people. One of the big myths about the ACLU is that we are anti-religious or anti-Christian, and nothing could be further from the truth. We spend a fair amount of time litigating people's rights to exercise their religion. We actually don't need to spend as much time representing Christians because usually they don't have a problem exercising their religion. So what people see is that we tend to be representing the Jews, the Muslims, the Rastafarians, anybody who has a religion that is not that well understood, because those are the people who are actually often prevented from exercising their religion. Okay. However, we do represent many Christians, and the occasion for that is often that the schools sometimes don't really understand the Establishment Clause. So, as I'm sure you probably know, in the First Amendment, there are 2 different kinds of protections of religion. One says you have the right to freely exercise your religion. The other says the government shall not establish a religion.
Mm-hmm.
So that means the government is not allowed to choose your religion for you. Now, it's not always easy to figure out how those 2 things go together. So what the Supreme Court says is that the law is as follows. If you're in a public high school, the school cannot choose a religion. They can't require everybody to pray a different, particular kind of prayer or to do anything that's really a religious observation. But on the other hand, because of the free exercise clause, the students have the right to exercise their religion, including during the day. So we have represented many Christian students, for example, a valedictorian of one high school, who wanted to talk in her speech about what her religion meant to her. And the school said, no, no, you can't do that because the school can't sponsor. Well, the school isn't sponsoring it if the valedictorian is saying it herself. So we went to bat for her. If students at a football game want to express their own religious point of view and pray, Tim Tebow can Tebow all he wants, that's an individual. But the school can't sponsor a prayer. So let me tell you 2 of my favorite cases about how earnest we are about being, neutral.
Okay.
One was a case that took place in a high school in Northern California, where this was a high school that had a lot of students who were of Hispanic descent. So the high school was going to have a Cinco de Mayo celebration. So there are some kids at the school who were not of Hispanic descent who don't like this. They don't want the school to be having a Cinco de Mayo celebration. So their plan is they have T-shirts with the American flag on it, and they want to have an America love it or leave it, counter demonstration. So the school says to them, you can't. That's going to cause disruption. We're having our Cinco de Mayo celebration, stay out of it. Mm-hmm. So a number of right-wing blogs, Rush Limbaugh among them, said, okay, so the ACLU is so hypocritical. Where's the ACLU when the American flag needs defending? They only represent all these communists and fascists and Muslims. So where are they when the American flag? And this caught fire, just went viral all over the right-wing blogs. The ACLU was so hypocritical. Well, the fact checkers, true that? Where was the ACLU? They'd already written a letter to the principal. The ACLU of Northern California had written a letter saying, let the kids wear their T-shirts. Okay, so we needed the fact checkers. My favorite example, in Virginia, there's another high school where the school wants to sponsor a Christian prayer before the football game. So the ACLU of Virginia has to write them a letter to say, that's not right. If the students want to have a prayer, that's okay. Can't have a school-sponsored prayer. Well, evidently they had a lawyer because somebody said to them, you can't do that, they're right. So there were a number of students who were really angry about this. So they wanted to have an anti-ACLU demonstration at the football game.
Excellent.
And the principal said to them, you can't do that, it's too disruptive. So you see it coming?
Yep.
Okay. The ACLU of Virginia had to say to the principal, let them have their anti-ACLU demonstration. Okay, so there are some of the myths I would like people to really understand, that we try as hard as we can to be neutral about the content, about the religion. We're not pushing politics, we're not pushing a particular religion. We just believe that people should have the right to decide those things for themselves.
And I personally have to absolutely agree. I mean, I think it's fabulous. Great organization, great mission, and all of that.
Well, thank you so much. So let me say to all of your viewers that I hope that everybody will consider going to aclu.org, check out what we're doing, and if you agree with at least 80% of what we're doing, become a card-carrying member. Really inexpensive for students. And we need the numbers. It's not just about money. We need to be able to say to President Obama, we represent 500,000 Americans who agree.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you so much, Curran. Great questions.
All right.